Thank you very much to the Chief of Police, Robin Smith, who joins me today to talk about the police approach to lockdown just after the government has announced that the stay-at-home order has been extended until the 11th of May. Chief, thanks for joining me.
Morning, Harry. How's it been for
Morning.
you?
First of all, speaking kind of generally, we're kind of almost a month in now to when the first stay-at-home order came into effect. People's lives have changed. I suppose the life of police officers have changed. Can you sum up kind of how things have been from your perspective over the past 3 to 4 weeks or so?
It's an interesting question, and I particularly enjoy the reference to policing has changed because, of course, policing has had to adjust as well. And in my 30-plus years service, I never thought I'd end up, if you like, policing a virus. And of course, that's what we're doing. We said from the outset that I was keen that our policing stance was one that at the end of all this, the public would see as being supportive. And that's exactly what we want to be. So you may have heard me say previously that States of Jersey Police and me as the chief officer, we're policing the virus. We really don't want to be policing you. And as I've said before also, you know, again, when I joined the police service many years ago, I never thought that I would be policing a virus where I'd be inviting people, if you like, to stay at home. I never thought in my first 4 months here that in that time we would close all the pubs and clubs, ask people to stay at home, and see a drop in crime over the last month by over 50%. So I think in many ways it's a mad world, but we've had to adjust. And I've got to say, I think the public have responded absolutely brilliantly. Yes, we've had some issues, but the tiny minority. And policing this has been tricky, but we've had some good support from our honorary police colleagues, and long may that continue.
Yeah, just in terms of the response from the public, you mentioned there it's been nearly in the majority very, very good. How does, in terms of the approach you take, especially over the last week or so, I suppose the longer this goes on, maybe the more difficult it gets. Has that been the kind of the gist you've been getting?
I think so. And I speak to chief officer colleagues twice a week, and I have done every week since effectively the stay-at-home order, or as some people see it as lockdown. And in many ways, that's quite helpful. Whilst I'm policing a slightly different environment to previous environments that I've policed, you know, the UK, England, and Wales is that bit probably 3 or 4 weeks ahead of us. The infection levels have been different, particularly in London, of course. And it's very helpful and very useful to get a sense of where they are and where we are so that we can learn from that. But as you know, we introduced from the outset what we described as the 4 E's. And I think that that's held us in good stead, and that includes the honorary police too. So as you will recall, I talked about engage, explain, encourage, and at the very last resort, enforce. And we've had to enforce very little, really. And of course, when we do enforce, it does mean that we've encouraged at least 3 times, if you get my meaning. We do it very reluctantly. But of course, you will know, and indeed I'm sure that your radio station gets this too, we also get complaints of where people are not complying, and we must react to those as well. Some of those where we provide advice, and others where the advice is given and people choose not to have that advice. And that's when we have to take more serious action, exclusively in the protection of the public, and that's what we're all about, protecting the public.
Yeah, you mentioned that those 4 E's and only going to enforce them when you really have to. But I suppose the longer this goes on, I think it's fair to say that everyone knows what the rules are now. I suppose there could have been that excuse from people at the start to say, oh, I wasn't really aware, or I wasn't sure I could do this, but I couldn't do that. But we're 3-4 weeks in now. Do you have to be more stricter now and say, look, we all know where we stand. If you're doing this, then we're going to be a bit more stricter with this. Or do you take the same approach now as you did at the start?
Well, I think we keep the same approach, and the reason I think we keep the same approach is because we often do we not go back to what the modelling and what the scientists say and the numbers say, and you'll have seen the most recent modelling from government and from government medical scientists, if I can use that description. And of course, the models that we've seen have not reached anywhere near the peaks, thankfully. That the public have responded, I have to say, absolutely magnificently. Yes, we've had some transgression, but of course the numbers speak for themselves, and you'll have seen what the model looks like, and it's nowhere near the trajectory that even we had hoped for. So that's probably the best evidence that I can get. Do I need to enforce more? If I saw that that peak was getting close, and then by which means the public weren't being kept safe, and of course the capacity in our hospitals was likely to be overwhelmed, then I think the police would have a different reaction and may need to enforce that. And I think the public would expect us to do that. But currently, looking at the numbers, you've seen them too, and there's already discussions being had about the easing of the lockdown, which I think is going to be, again, challenging and difficult for everybody to readjust and adjust again. But no, I don't think there's a need to do that just yet, but we monitor it and we have a meeting about it every day.
Right. One of the reasons I ask that is we've got a lot of questions on this, and I'll go into more specific ones a bit later. But the general gist of a lot of the questions we've had is sometimes frustration that they see things and think, well, I've seen this person do this and I don't think they should do that. And they're wondering why they're being allowed to so-called get away with it.
I said at the outset of all of this that the danger was, well, the inevitability, I guess, is that States of Jersey police would turn into what I described as the COVID cops, that we would be asked lots and lots of questions. And indeed, whilst the number of those questions have tailed off in the recent week, actually, we have answered and fielded so many questions in our communications room, as indeed the government, on all kinds of different scenarios about what's allowed and what's not allowed. And can you fish? Can you surf? I've even been asked, can you walk on a particular side of the pavement? I make no judgments about any of those questions, because what I think is that people care and people want to try and get it right. And they're asking for police advice and indeed government advice, but in this case, police advice on how to get it right. I think the community has responded brilliantly to social distancing. You can see it everywhere you go now. I think it might continue for a while longer, even after all the restrictions are off, whenever that may be. So there will always be those examples. So, for example, at St Juan's Bay over the weekend, concerns about surfers. I'm pretty confident that a number of your listeners will have seen lots and lots of cops. Indeed, I was up there on Saturday afternoon as well. The surfers responded brilliantly, accepting, of course, that the waves weren't up, or whatever the phrase is. But there will always be those examples. But just to give you a sense, in the 4 weeks that we've had the stay-at-home order, officers, both honorary officers and ourselves, we've visited 728 parks and beaches over that time, just to provide the reassurance required. We take details of every single issue, concern or complaint. That's the reason why we changed our policing operations slightly for St Juan's on the weekend. And this morning we talked about, myself and the senior team, about what our plans are for the forthcoming bank holidays, because we suspect that they will be busier too, and how are we going to police those as well.
Yeah, you mentioned that, say, the majority of people have been very good and applied by the instructions they've been given, but there have been a few transgressions. I think people will want to know how many there've been. I think it was widely publicised at the start that a couple of people had to be arrested and charged, and we know obviously they got the subsequent punishment for that. Can you tell us through facts and figures of what you've received so far in terms of people who've had to be, you've had to make that decision to use the powers that you've been given?
Yes, of course. Now, it was just interesting listening to the police radio over the last couple of weekends, and indeed on Saturday. I would say probably 60-70% of all radio traffic is related to COVID-19. And it is calls from public saying, we've seen this, we've seen that, all of which are helpful comments and helpful observations, all of which I have no problem with whatsoever. And officers were then being provided with tactical advice around the restrictions. So this sort of gives an illustration of how careful we're trying to be, complying with the restrictions, but also recognising that some people won't comply. So, for example, parties, and some people decide to have parties and barbecues, all the things that you would normally do in any other time, but of course not now, given the risk of spread. In terms of enforcements, since we started what we describe as Operation Tala, which we commenced at the back end of last month, 17 enforcements, so 17 arrests where people have been arrested. Some have received some form of caution, and you know those that have been before the magistrates' court. It's important, though, that people realise, and I'm sure they do, that this is not without having, first of all, explained and encouraged. And so there was one individual, I'd share this with you to get a sense of the sensitivity that we operate here. There was some chatter over the radio on Saturday where an officer called in and said, I'm with X again, confirm how many times has he been cautioned, and he had been cautioned twice because we keep data and all those things. He got cautioned for a third time, next time he will be in. So we're careful about that sort of thing, but putting that all into context, we have given words of advice to over 1,100 people in the last 4 or so weeks. If you think about how many operations we've had, how many days that we've had since we've been running that operation, 1,100 feels about the right number. And we have stopped 8,000 vehicles over that time too. So 17 enforcements against 8,000 vehicle stops. I mean, those vehicle movements could be completely legitimate, of course, but it is trying to gently check and just try and make sure done in a really sensible and responsible way. In that time, we've closed 6 premises. And these were very much the early days where arrangements had not been made. Of course, now there are takeaway facilities, and sometimes get some complaints about those. But I think that the businesses are trying to do their best, trying to operate, and I walk around the town quite a lot, and I think that they're trying to respond carefully, and we will support them in doing that, as I saw over the weekend when I went up to the Water Splash to see what they were trying to do. So that gives you some context. 17 enforcements against an awful lot of stuff.
Yeah, obviously a lot of areas to cover, but we've had a brilliant response from Channel 103 listeners, and I want to be able to put their questions to you as well. You spoke earlier about the extra patrolling. Some Wansbay you mentioned as a hotspot that you wanted to really keep an eye on. A few people have got in touch about certain areas, St Wansbay being one, Cheapside, and St Albans Promenade as well. And a lot of people have been asking the question of, could or should something be done to separate walkers and cyclists? Because a lot of people are saying the 2 metre rule we've all been told to abide by, it's too crowded to be able to do that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm really pleased, and in fact, I've learnt this in the short time that I've been the Chief of Police here, is that people really care about this stuff. At this morning's meeting, because it was part of the briefing I've been prepared over the last 24 hours, is issues around the avenue and the cycle path there, where there are lots of cyclists. There were indeed lots of cyclists on Sunday afternoon when I was around. And of course, then you've got people who are enjoying a walk, combined with people who are also jogging. I am very reluctant to get into closing off cycle paths when size is very important to everybody, and I don't really think that's really something we want to do. We must keep encouraging people to socially distance, and I think people are really striving to do that. But particularly over the weekend, largely because we spoke about it in my morning meeting at 8 o'clock, there is likelihood that people will see more police and honorary officers as well around the avenue area and the cycle path over this coming weekend and then the bank holiday weekend, to look at opportunities where we might be able to try and thin that out in the interests of everybody's safety. It's going to be really, really tricky. I encourage people to also look for other locations when they can cycle to, because those areas are popular. But as we said from the outset, we're in this together, and we will work it out together. I don't foresee that we would necessarily need to enforce, but if it gets too busy, then we might have to think about how we can divert people to different locations.
Brilliant. And just on the subject of people gathering and congregating, might as well ask a couple of questions that we've come in just on that subject while we're on it. Diane has got in touch with us on Facebook. She says, are people allowed to congregate outside takeaway coffee shops without observing the social distancing rule?
No. Again, I feel like I end up becoming that COVID cop again. And I know my officers get asked all kinds of questions, which are entirely right. And Diane is entirely right to ask the question, of course. The best source of information is the government website, and we are encouraging people to go to the government website. But in answer to a question, I have been asked, as I mentioned before, as indeed my officers have, all kinds of questions about what's allowed and what's not allowed. Really been reluctant to say whether you can or can't fish, or whether you can or can't surf, or whatever the issue is. The issue, and this is a bit that Diane is of course focusing on, and she's absolutely right, is it's about socially distancing. If you're at a takeaway, waiting to receive your food, or having received your food, particularly around some of the kiosks where we've had some issues, then you must socially distance. If you do not socially distance, then we will reluctantly look to close down the kiosk. As I said, close down 6 premises. We won't hesitate to close down others. So, no, if you're not socially distancing, to be specific in answer to Diane.
Yeah, and just on that as well, in terms of social distancing, we know that the 2 hours we've been told that exercise is permitted for that, but we had lots of people get in touch with us saying they've seen people drinking in parks, but they are social distancing. Do you allow that to happen, or do you say, look, that's not exercise to go out drinking whilst, even though they are social distancing?
I think there will be lots and lots of questions around what's allowed and what's not allowed. Again, the socially distancing thing is the thing that underpins everything. But I said, as you will know, in the press conference that you took part in a few weeks ago, this is about our own public conscience. What people will say at the end of all this: what did you do during this crisis? Did you do the right thing? And I think the vast majority of people say, yeah, I did the right thing. And certainly, as I've said before, the scientific data would seem to suggest that is the case. Drinking in parks, and again, my officers have been to those events. There was an issue again yesterday. No is the answer. You can't sit in a park and have a drink. These are the rules that have been set out. It isn't exercise, can't be seen as exercise. So I would encourage people not to do that.
Yeah. And moving on slightly to, as I say, the police response. We know, as you mentioned, that a lot of people we've seen being stopped when they're driving to ask, legitimate questions about what they might be doing. What's the response been, or the approach to doing that, in terms of who you stop, when you do it, where you do it, in terms of making it right, so you're not doing it too much, but you're not doing it enough, if that makes sense?
No, it makes a lot of sense. And indeed, we talk about, when I meet with the senior team, we talk about flexing, about sometimes we do more and sometimes we do less. So, for example, over the Easter break, we did the majority of those 8,000 stops over that Easter break. And some of the thinking of that, which I share with you and our listeners, is we were trying and set for islanders the right rhythm, the sense of, we're all seeking to adjust with this. So again, particularly with our honorary colleagues who did the lion's share of the vehicle stops, for which I'm enormously grateful. I think in that weekend, that long weekend, the Friday through to the Monday, we did about 5,000, maybe a little bit less, but certainly around half, if not a bit more, of those checks then. And then we thought, right, we've sort of set that. We're trying to help people adjust. And then we removed some of those vehicle checks so that we could flex in other locations, for example, going to beaches and various other things. So we are trying to, flex when we need to. We were talking only this morning about maybe doing a few more vehicle checks over the coming bank holiday weekends, all of which are part of a suite of tactics. But again, to police the virus, not people. And whenever we've done those stops, that we are explaining why we're doing it. And my feedback is the vast majority of people understand why we're doing it. And of course, we're doing it for them. So, yeah, we'll flex. Not sure what we will do next, but you probably will see some more vehicle checks over the bank holiday.
Yeah, in terms of, I say, the vast majority are happy and abiding and go on their way. For those who don't, whether that be people you stop driving or people you stop walking, running, whatever it may be, who aren't observing such things as social distancing. What's the attitude like to officers? I know we referenced it before. Is it a case of people not knowing? Is that a regular thing? People say they don't know. Is it people knowing but just saying, "Look, I don't care. I'll do my own thing"? What's that sort of response been?
It's far closer to the latter than the former.
Okay.
As you said, at the top of all this, Harry, that people are now pretty well versed, aren't they? People are used to queuing to go into shops at a socially distanced way, sort of 2 meters. I see people going out of their way to get out of people's way, if you get my meaning. I've seen it myself when I've gone into the shops. But there will always be those few, and those few, particularly probably about half a dozen of those few, were probably always going to come in anyway, for a whole host of different reasons. And of course, we received members of the public who were contacting us, expressing some concern around that, and it's important that we reacted to that. So this is very much the sort of the high core end, if you like. The vast majority understand it. Some of them don't comply with it, and then they're advised. We've given words of advice to, as I said, 1,170 people now, and I would think that probably 1,160 of those have listened to the words of advice, because we do it in a sensible way. And then the few 10 that are left over, well, they weren't going to listen to anybody's advice, whether we're in crisis or otherwise, in which case they find themselves in front of the magistrate.
Yeah. In terms of the actual roadside checks, I know a lot of people seeing cars being stopped, as we've mentioned. A lot of people have got in touch with us asking, with cyclists, is it the same approach? I think people feel that they can get away quite easily, or maybe they're not being stopped as much as cars. Can you address that?
I think they're probably not being stopped as much as cars. I think that's a fair comment. I think probably cyclists are probably in a slightly different place, in that often they are exercising, and in many cases they're alone anyway. And if they're not alone, they are sort of socially distanced. I guess when you've got 2, 3, 4 people in a car, then that's of course something that you would want us to check, and the public would want us to check. Often, the vast majority of cases, it's people who live together, families, for obvious reasons. So I wouldn't say it's as much as that they get away with it, but I think the circumstances are different. But I go back to my earlier point. If people want to use that phrase, get away with it, then that's part of their conscience. Because, the police service can't police their way out of this, and nor have we ever sought to. That's why we've targeted the hotspot locations, and indeed, you've seen, again, I refer back to the data. The data is showing that people are, done a fantastic job. I mean, if anybody has seen the modelling, the modelling is just goes to show how much people care in Jersey about this virus and it not spreading. So I go back to that, and I'm massively encouraged.
Yeah, I suppose just on that, I think probably the reason people do get in touch and ask these questions, as you say, it's because they care, and they see maybe things. Cyclists, they think, oh, I've seen them, they've been out more than 2 hours, but maybe if they are by themselves, maybe you get a little bit of leeway. But I suppose that's, as I mentioned before, people do care, and that's why they ask these questions. I'm guessing you understand why they're doing that, and you suppose you want to, as you say, ask to answer as many of them as you can, even though, as you say, it's a difficult job.
Well, I think people do that because they do care. That's why I mentioned about being asked all the questions. If people didn't care, they wouldn't ask the questions, would they? And I think, as I've said before, the numbers show that people really do care, and the outcomes are there to speak for themselves. Of course, the challenge will come now as we adjust to any prospects of the easing of the stay-at-home restrictions. I'm not cited on what they might be yet, but I know they're being discussed, as you'd expect any government to start discussing that, as they are indeed in the UK. And then it'll be how we then adjust to that, and that'll be a bit more of the flex, Harry, and working with islanders to see how we can best deliver that, which keeps everybody safe. But I would be more concerned if we didn't get calls like that, and then I would be asking ourselves, do we really care?
Brilliant. And just for a quick fire kind of bullet points, if we can, from people who've asked questions again. in terms of driving, again, maybe there's a bit of confusion. I think maybe when you, as you mentioned, the press briefing that you attended a few weeks ago, where there maybe was a bit of a differing message between what you've said and maybe what the government said in terms of driving and where you can go. I think you made the point that maybe you'd rather people stay close to home where they exercise, and the government says they want us to enjoy the beautiful areas we've got and to travel to do that. Was there confusion? Was that a mistake to say that? And do you think that's been addressed and clarified now, or do you think there's still that confusion that needs addressing?
I think we're all adjusting, but I think you can achieve the same thing with both answers to the question, actually. And I don't think there was anything wrong in what was said there. We're all trying to understand what this means. Of course, I look back again, and sorry to refer back to the UK, but of course, they've had all kinds of issues with people travelling very, very long distances to exercise. Well, of course, we can't do that here on the island. I go back to public conscience. If you need to travel, and we would rather you didn't travel to exercise, if you can travel closer to home, or indeed don't need to travel, then that's the best thing in terms of spreading the infection. And that's where I keep going back to. And that's, again, the public have been great in trying to work that out.
Yeah. And with driving, as you mentioned, you'd rather people not travel if they don't have to. And we're seeing a lot of quieter roads now. And I think a lot of people have said maybe they're seeing people not sticking to speed limits. They see the quieter roads and think they can go a bit faster. Is that something you're really conscious of? And how are you policing maybe speeding on maybe quieter and smaller roads?
Not something that's come across my desk, to be fair, Harry, although I did meet up with some colleagues from the Honorary Police in Helier, just down from the police station on Sunday afternoon. They were doing a speed check just by Green Street. But it did strike me that there were very many issues down there. So it's not really been something that has been a particular concern to me. Okay.
And I suppose people can be scared as well in terms of people getting, police officers getting stopped. You can be seen as it can be a scary situation. Maybe they haven't been stopped by police before. They're driving along and mind their own business. And I suppose when you're in a queue and you might be stopping some people and not others, they might think, oh God, I'm really nervous. And mental health is an important aspect of this, and doing it in a sensitive way. How do you approach that in terms of people may be afraid to even leave their home in fear of being stopped?
I think it probably goes even wider than that. Harry, I think there's an awful lot of people who will be scared and concerned about not only during the lockdown and having to distance themselves, it's enormously socially disruptive as well, and the impact that will have on people's mental health that we've seen in Europe and we've seen in the UK, and undoubtedly we will see here. In fact, that's going on now. So I think people will be scared, and that's when I think the police service, government, and indeed all the charitable organisations as well, all of which have been engaged in how do we respond to what happens as a result of this, as we begin to move out of it, whenever we do. You'll have seen that government and the police service introduced this a couple of weeks ago. Just appreciate it. For those listeners, it's not too great, but you will have seen, do you fear for your family's welfare? See it, hear it, report it. And that's been done with a safeguarding partnership, ourselves, and Jersey Putting Children First. We recognise that actually what we've seen is a reduction in the number of children coming to our notice, an increase in the number of adults coming to our notice, normally people who are vulnerable. So, we are looking and we are concerned about what might be happening behind closed doors. You'll have seen some of this also in other places. And that's the reason why we're all working together to look at what might be seen as the forward plan as we come out of that. And those sorts of discussions are being had now, but also you'll have seen what we introduced, I think it was last week now, around the see it, hear it, report it, so that people can report to us and we're there for you when you need us. And in particular, if you are scared, we'll be there for you now, be there for you in the future.
Yeah, just on that safeguarding, I know it's a question that's been asked throughout this, ever since lockdown came into force, really, the fear that people are becoming more isolated now, and that can be a very worrying thing, and especially with domestic abuse incidents. I know you said a few weeks ago there has been a slight rise then. What's the response been then? Has there been a bigger increase in reports over the past few weeks?
Well, in terms of domestic incidents, reports of domestic incidents, we've seen an increase of 14%. And it's always important, I think, to whenever you give a percentage, you give sort of a sense of the numbers. And this is since we've had the stay-at-home period. So we've gone from 86 in the period, in same period in 2019, to 98 in 2020. So not enormous numbers, but a percentage increase of 14%, which we are concerned about because these are clearly incidents in people's homes. So an increase in terms of incidents. In terms of crimes reported as a result of that, we've seen a decrease in domestic crimes reported of 36% over that period. So that's 53 down to 34. And I think that concerns me more, that those numbers are down, because is that as a result of people not able to report? So, it's one of those police figures where I look at that and think that's something that I need to understand more and encourage more. And I do that by referencing not only, Contact Police, but also the Children and Families Hub. And I can give you all these numbers and you can use these on your websites too. Youth Inquiry Service, I've got this list here. I'm not doing this from memory because it's that important. Jersey Domestic Abuse Support, and also, of course, the Jersey Women's Refuge. Those agencies are waiting and ready, and that doesn't include also victim support, emergency housing, and parenting support helpline, and of course the National Childline as well. So those people, particularly in Jersey, are there, and they're still there, and they can help and support anybody that needs help, both now and in the future.
Yeah, and in terms of the support you give to especially the most vulnerable, especially maybe the elderly, I think we've seen officers going around to certain people. So I think we saw a nice video of letting a cat out at one stage. It must be quite nice and important for you to do things like that to show more the human side of the police, but to show that you're looking out for all the most vulnerable out there who may be more scared and worried at such a difficult time.
If there was ever a time for the police service, and indeed our other emergency service colleagues, including the honorary police, if there was ever a time when the police service needed to be there, be visible, so visible are we that I've spent 30 years trying to get the CID in uniform, and they're all in uniform because they realise the importance of being visible to reassure our communities. I dare say when this is all done, they're going to clamour to get their suits back on, but that'll be a discussion for another time. But the serious point is yes, you did see Joe with the cats and doing the right thing. We in the police service, we see our duty, doing our duty for the public, as something that's really important to us. We even say an oath that talks about protection of life and property. People join the police service because it's a vocational thing, and it's something that we really want to do, and we will continue to step into that place. Particularly, there is a concern about the older elements of our community who may need that additional help for us, and indeed we're pleased to go and give that help whenever we can.
Yeah, and it's the same, I suppose, for say the elderly and even youngsters. I suppose it can be, it is going to be as scary for them as it is for the elderly. What is it? Obviously, different approach for different people. But what are you doing from that perspective, especially for vulnerable younger people who maybe don't understand the worries and there's everything that's going on at the moment?
Yes, and I think that's again, I go back to the see it, hear it, report it type messaging. Some of the messaging you'll have seen from government as well. Our younger people, this must be particularly as they're not able to go to school, very, very disruptive to young people. The impact that might have on our young people's mental health, both now and in the future. Some of the stuff you've already seen, I think you're likely to see an awful lot more too. And I think we'll see more reporting when we get back to what people are, probably an overused phrase now, but people are using it a lot, as to what the new normality will be. And I think we will probably see more of that when our young people go back to schools, and we'll see more reporting as a result of that, and we need to be ready for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going through a few kind of more bullet points again, and I've only got a few minutes left. I think it's the start of May, isn't it? That we're scheduled at the moment that the dog walking restrictions on beaches change. What's your personal view on that? Because I suppose whether it changes or whether it doesn't, that has an effect on what police do, doesn't it? Or how things work.
It's you're well informed, Harry. I don't say you're well informed. I've had a couple of email exchanges about my views about whether we should extend um, the opportunity for people to have to walk their dogs on beaches, and there is a view that it shouldn't, and there is a view that some views that it is. So, in response to an email that I received last week, I've just asked for some views from my staff, and then I will form my own view. I think there are some competing views on either side. That I still think there's going to be a degree of restriction. Well, undoubtedly, there's going to be a degree of restriction into May, and there may be some really good arguments that actually it's a great thing for people to be able to do. Walk their dog on the beaches for a bit longer, bearing in mind the beaches aren't going to be as busy as they ordinarily would be in May. And then there are some competing arguments against that too. So when I receive that back, which I should do sort of middle of the week, the Thursday, I guess, post that, I'll give a view. But of course, my view is one of many, but I'll share that view when I've got back to my team.
Right. So the main reason I asked that is because we've got some obviously big, lovely beaches. I've been very impressed. I live near one myself. You see people spreading out on social distancing and abiding by the rules. And I suppose if you take that away, that limits the amount of space. They go into busier areas, and that might cause more of an issue.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of compelling reasons why you might want to extend that. And also, we've talked about mental health as well. People being able to walk their dog is something that I think find incredibly pleasurable. So whether we extend it and whether we enforce it are two different things, of course. But I want to be sure that I understand everybody's point of view before we sort of make a decision on that.
Sure. And before we sum things up, one more subject I'd like to cover with you on police staff sickness. I suppose we're all been affected in one way or another by COVID-19. Are you able to say how many State of Jersey police officers are off sick at the moment and how that's impacting resources, and also how that's affecting morale of staff? Because I suppose, as we've spoken before, police officers I don't think they expected to join the force to be able to do this, especially the new officers that are coming in at the moment.
Well, as I said before, why we are no different to islanders. We are, as I've said before, we are citizens in uniform, doing the job on their behalf, and we can get as sick as everybody else, and all those other descriptions that we could use. So, but of course, the police service. It's probably slightly a cliche, but we quite like a crisis. We like to step into those places because we feel as though there's a job to be done and we want to do it. Remarkably, really, our sickness levels, I get this updated every single day, but our sickness levels are exactly comparable with the same period last year, which is sort of surprising, is it not? We get our staff tested as quickly as we possibly can so that we can get them back on duty. We took a lot of very important steps very early on about putting our staff in all kinds of different locations. Approximately a third of all of my staff are working away from home, and they've got the technology to do that. And we've all learned to use this sort of thing that we probably won't go back to lots of it. We've learned so much. We've deployed some of our more specialist capabilities, like firearms officers, into different places on the island, because we recognise how important that asset is to keeping people safe. And we have organisationally distanced in a way that I am, in a wonderful police station, but quite lonely. I don't want you to feel sad for 1 minute there, Harry, but because at least I have the ability to come to work. So, but the important thing is we took all those steps really early. So our overall availability rate is 85%, which is incredible given what's going on currently. So I'm delighted with that. And yes, we've got 11 new recruits. You'll have seen that. We've even got a journalist. There you go. It just goes to show even journalists will become police officers. I'm delighted to see them too. And I took the decision, really, it's quite an easy decision to be fair, that we should continue with our recruiting process, albeit, of course, that we normally then send them over to England to be trained. I took decision that whilst we can't do that, we will still recruit them. I think it sends a strong message to islanders that not only are we dealing with today, we keep our eye on tomorrow and the next day, because they are the future of policing in SOJP. You'll have seen they've got quite an eclectic mix of all kinds of different people. We've even got a tennis coach. So, who would have thought? But the important thing is you saw them, they are being trained by officers and staff here in States of Jersey Police. Inevitably, that we will at the right time send them for additional training into England. But we will be able to deploy them properly protected and looked after by experienced officers. But of course, they are also there to provide visibility and the rest. Because frankly, whilst we're in this period, life still must go on. And you'll have seen that, even yesterday, somebody was convicted yesterday for breaking the windows and entering the royal courts, etc. There are all kinds of other policing going on, what we call others call business as usual, in addition to this as well. So, and the public expect us to get stuck into those other baddies as well.
Absolutely. And just to sum things up then before I let you go, nearly a month now, as I mentioned at the start. I suppose for a lot of people that felt like a really, really long time. As you say, life has changed for all of us. It's very difficult, but it's all being done for an important reason. We all know that. What's your message to people at this stage? We know that it's been extended, this stay-at-home order, till the 11th of May. The plan to exit is being obviously formalised and announced later this week. But what's your message to people as things stand in terms of, obviously, there's been a brilliant job so far, but it's not over yet. And I suppose the temptation will be that people might think, oh, we're getting to the end. I might, start to do a bit more that I wasn't allowed to before. What's your general message at this stage from a police perspective?
I think you've just said it for me, Harry, there. I think that was the perfect answer. Okay, the serious bit is there's a danger that we throw away all the good stuff and all the sort of painful stuff that we've had to do in the last 4 weeks. I don't think that's going to happen for 1 second, actually. I think our community, for want of a better phrase, gets this. We certainly, States of Jersey Police and our honorary police colleagues will be out there doing exactly the same thing. And you can expect to be stopped and asked, again, in that very appropriate way. I don't think islanders will see much difference irrespective of whether the restrictions are eased or whatever the phrase is. We will still be there doing our thing, again, to police the virus, not them. So my message would be, let's see what the new restrictions are. But the key bit must be to continue to be socially distanced so that we don't spread this thing, and therefore we aren't able to deal with the challenges that will bring. So I would say maybe we're at half time, maybe we're 1-0 up. We don't want to finish the full game 4-1 down, if you know what I mean.
I think that sums it up nicely. State of Jersey Police Chief Robin Smith, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Harry.
Thank you very much.